There is something you've been building your whole life that was already complete before the most important person in the room ever showed up to see it. And most people never realize that. Most people spend their entire lives rearranging the set for an audience of one who may never come. I'm Mark Roach. This is Transcendent. Across decades in business, athletics, and art, my life circumstances have led me to question and look deeper into my own beliefs, as well as those of others. What I want to explore today is something I've been sitting with through a body of research that connects human psychology, behavioral data, economics, quantum physics, and a 1996 mockumentary into what I believe is the most honest picture I've seen of why so many people feel chronically insufficient and what that actually means for where we go from here. By the end, I want you to understand three things. First, why the experience of waiting for external validation is not a personal failure, but a structural feature of the world that you were handed. Second, why the people who appear to have escaped that trap, the ones who refuse the awards and walk away from the system, may actually be reinforcing the very thing they're rejecting. And third, where genuine sufficiency actually comes from and why the answer is both smaller and more powerful than anything the current system can offer. There's a piece of this that changes the entire picture, that it involves a question that physics itself began to ask about nature, the nature of consciousness. I'll get to that. But first, let me start with a chair. In 1996, Christopher Guest made a film called Waiting for Guffman. It's about a small town in Missouri staging a community musical to celebrate its 150th anniversary. The director invites a Broadway producer named Mort Guffman to attend the opening night. And from that moment, everything changes. Not the show itself, but the meaning the cast assigns to the show. They begin pouring everything they have into a production that was already good for an audience that was already there in order to impress a single person that none of them had ever met. Opening night arrives, Guffman's seat is empty. He never came. The show goes on, the audience loves it, and still the cast experiences something close to devastation because the meaning of the show had been outsourced to someone who never showed up. Here's why this matters. That film is not a satire of small-town naivete. It's a mirror. The experience of building something real and then waiting for an authority figure to confirm it exists is one of the most universal human experiences on the planet, and it's getting significantly worse. A researcher named Sandra Matz spent years studying what your digital behavior reveals about your inner life, your search history, your purchase patterns, the way you move through platforms at different hours of the day. And what she found is that gap between who you perform yourself to be and who you actually are shows up in data whether you want it to or not. The data doesn't care about your curated identity. It reads your behavioral residue, the trail of what you actually do, especially when no one is performing for an audience. And that residue consistently reveals a level of psychological vulnerability that most people would never voice out loud. Facebook had an internal document, and this was confirmed, offering advertisers the ability to target teenagers at the precise moments of emotional insecurity. Not in spite of that vulnerability, but because of it. The void isn't an accident of the system. It is in many ways the system's primary product. Now stay with me here because this is where it gets a little more complex than it may first appear. The experience of insufficient identity, the feeling of that who you are is not quite enough until someone important confirms it, does not begin with a platform. It begins much earlier than that. What the research on fatherlessness, attachment theory, and early development psychology converges on is this: the experience of being seen, specifically and accurately, by someone who matters to you in early life is the foundational condition for building what psychologists call a secure sense of self. When that experience is absent, when the people who should have been your first audience weren't watching or weren't capable of watching, you grow up with what I can only describe as an unfilled seat in the front row of your own life. And you spend an enormous amount of energy, often unconsciously, trying to fill it. The platform didn't create that vacancy. It just found it, measured it, and monetized it. Here's what most people miss about this. The problem isn't that the void exists. The problem is that the void has been made to feel permanent. A 1973 economist named E.F. Schumacher wrote in a book that he was considering among that was considered to be one of the most 100 influential books published since World War II, and that almost nobody in the current conversation seems to remember, was that every increase in manufactured needs tends to increase your dependency on outside forces you cannot control, and therefore increases existential fear. That is not a metaphor. That's a description of deliberate economic architecture. A person who experiences themselves as sufficient generates less economic activity than a person who is perpetually reaching for something just out of range. So the system has a structural interest in keeping the seat empty, not because anyone is sitting in a room plotting against you, but because your insufficiency is quite literally an inventory item. Now, what I need to introduce, I want to introduce a even more complication here, because it would just be too simple if it were only about ordinary people and ordinary vulnerability. So in 1973, Marlon Brando won Best Actor for The Godfather. He sent a woman to the stage to decline it on his behalf, using the moment to protest Hollywood's treatment of Native Americans. The audience split between booing and applause. Now in 2026, just recently, Sean Penn won Best Supporting Actor, and he was not at the ceremony. He was in the Ukraine. He has previously handed one of his Oscars to the president of Ukraine as a gesture of solidarity. The gesture matters, and yet here is the thing that has stayed with me since I began turning this over. Both men proved the power of the system by refusing it. You cannot make a statement by walking away from an Oscar unless the Oscar still means something to the room you're walking away from. The refusal requires the desire of everyone else in order to work. Brando and Penn are not outside the system. They are using the system's own gravity as leverage. And that leverage is only available to people who have already been crowned. The rest of us are still in Blaine, Missouri, still the stool capital of the world, still building the show, still watching the door. But here is where I need to slow down and tell you something I have observed across decades of studying consciousness in real conditions, not in theory. George Carlin understood the mechanics of this trap more clearly than almost anyone who has ever stood on a stage. He spent 50 years diagnosing precisely the way human beings construct systems of external approval and then surrender everything they have to maintain them. He called it giving away your power. And he was right, but the psychological portrait of Carlin that emerges from a careful reading of his life and his work shows something harder to sit with. His audience became his Guffman. When it kept laughing and not changing, he eventually concluded that change wasn't possible. And then his final years were defined by contempt rather than compassion. So Carlin, he sat down in a very empty chair, or he sat down in the very chair that he had spent a lifetime pointing out. This is not a criticism of Carlin. That's a description of what happens when the diagnosis has no exit. So where is the exit? Well, Schumacher believed it was scale. He argued that people can only be fully themselves in small, comprehensible groups. That the intermediate scale, the human scale, is where identity actually forms, where work actually carries meaning, where the feedback loop between what you do and what it produces runs through relationships that you can see and trust. The craftsperson who owns their own tools and serves a community they know directly does not need an algorithm to tell them whether the work was good. The person in genuine conversation with one other person they trust is having an experience that no platform can replicate, optimize, or sell. This is not nostalgia for the past. This is a systems diagnosis. Human sufficiency is scale dependent. It flourishes below a certain threshold and collapses above it. Research from PEN America found that one-on-one conversations with trusted local messengers change actual behavior in 89% of participants. Not viral campaigns, not large-scale movements. One person talking to one person they already knew. That is not scalable. And I want to suggest to you that this is precisely the point. Now, the question that has been underneath all of this, the one I promised I would get to, does quantum physics offer any actual ground for hope beyond what Carlin could see? Well, the honest answer requires separating two different claims. The popular version, the idea that your thoughts literally create your reality, is an overstatement that most physicists do not support. Quantum effects operate at subatomic scales, and the leap to macroscopic everyday experience is not as clean as the popular literature suggests. But the legitimate version of this insight is genuinely significant, and I think it matters to this conversation. What quantum theory has formally dismantled is the classical physics picture of human beings as mechanical subatoms whose choices are simply the predetermined output of prior causes. The observer in quantum mechanics is not a passive recorder of a fixed reality. The act of observation participates in determining what is observed. Consciousness is not an epiphenomenon, a side effect of matter that doesn't actually do anything. It is an active participant in the construction of experience. Now, neuroscience has confirmed the practical dimensions of this. The way the person directs their attention over time physically alters the structure and function of the brain. You are not just watching your life from the inside, you are, in a measurable sense, shaping it. Here's what that means in the context of everything we've been discussing. The person whose sense of identity is entirely a reflection of external signals, whose whole orientation is pointed at the empty chair is surrendering the most powerful thing they have, the capacity to be their first own observer, to be a sufficient witness to their own experience before anyone else in the room weighs in. That capacity does not require the seat to be filled. It does not require the algorithm to confirm it. It does not require Guffman to show up. Now, this channel began as a resource for people navigating complex PTSD. But Transcendent is for everyone, anyone human who faces pain or transformation at various points in life. Sometimes that pain is less obvious. Sometimes it's unseen until the very end. What matters is the journey away from the outdated patterns toward a spirit that cannot be duplicated by artificial intelligence or healed through force. That's what we explore here. The synthesis of all this research points somewhere specific. They show in Blaine was already good. The audience was already there. The meaning was already real. The only thing that made Guffman's seat matter was the cast's inability to inhabit their own authority, their own sufficiency as witness to their own work. That's not a small thing to name because most of us were never given the conditions to develop that capacity. The system we were handed was specifically designed to prevent it. And yet, the research on small-scale human connection, the neuroscience of directed attention, the economics of human-scale work, all of it points toward the same possibility. Not a viral breakthrough, not a platform movement, a conversation between two people who can actually see each other. That is where new strength rises, not because it scales, because it doesn't have to. If you want to go deeper into any of this, the architecture of identity, the psychology of sufficiency, the territory between consciousness and the world it inhabits, my work and more than 20 books that are available at roachcreative.com. Otherwise, just stay with what landed here. The ideas that stay with you are usually the ones that you already know, but hadn't yet let yourself say out loud. I'm Mark Roach. This is Transcendent, wishing you all the best. The most sophisticated system ever built for understanding you was designed not to fill the empty seat, but to sell you the illusion that it could.